To be honest with you, I'm super confused. I agreed last minute to do this talk, but I was assured that no one would be here to see it. And the fact that there are people in this audience is terrifying in many, many ways. And I do, by the way, recognize that I am the only thing standing between you and a happy hour by the pool. Because I generally don't like people or following directions, I'm going to make this long and painful so that you miss a good opportunity to have fun outside. Of course, I'm joking. My goal really is to make this short and sweet. Do bear with me. I have never presented this material before. Some of it I learned about recently. But I think we can move through this pretty quickly. If you do have questions, by all means, do ask away. We have arrayed about you many StarTree employees. So any really deep, technical, thought-provoking questions, really anything that requires something more than a yes or no, I'm going to direct you to one of the other folks in the room from StarTree. Let's get started. The title of this talk is Unveiling the Impatience Economy. My name is actually Tim Vail, so there's kind of a nice little pun there. I'm also affectionately referred to here and in other places as the other Tim. Some of you may know Tim Berglund. He's a well-known person in the developer relations community and other places. When I enter into rooms and they hear Tim is coming to speak, and then they realize it's not Tim Berglund, they all get very disappointed. So here we are. Let's make it quick. Let's have some fun, if we can, and talk a little bit about something that we heard this morning in Kishore's talk, I think. So there has been all sorts of wonderful things written about different ways to define kind of the space that we're in, the economy that surrounds us. Here are some of the ones that I read about earlier. The data economy. There's this wonderful article about, we've moved from the barter economy into the data economy. I didn't know what any of that meant, by the way, but it sounded very interesting, and there'd been lots of writing about it. There's real-time, the real-time economy. I don't know if that resonates with anybody, but I didn't really want to use that. The on-demand economy. I think actually that's the thing that Kishore said this morning, the on-demand economy. But I actually kind of like this term, impatience economy. For some reason, that strikes kind of to the core of who I am, and to some extent the core of my boss, Jeff, who also happens to be in the room. This is a man who deeply understands what it means to be impatient. And anyway, you guys, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into. That's partly why we're going to move through this very quickly. Anyhow. The impatience economy, I really do think, is a thing. It's here. We heard a little bit about it today in Kishore, and even in some of the other conversations and talks today, you've heard a little about it. But what is it? I mean, what is it to me? These are just a couple quick examples of what impatience is and what it's driving in the world and the economy. I and Jeff and my children, we're frequently losing our patience. And I mean, you understand what this is, right? We've all experienced this at some level. I think we all experience this with these things. But you can, as you're thinking, you're probably impatient with this guy, like this talk, like, can this get over? Like, this, move on. Anyhow, this is a real thing. I mean, it's driving transformational change across all sorts of industries. Here's some great examples. And of course, we've had the wonderful opportunity to hear from the folks at Uber. But, we've gone from waiting and struggling to call a taxi, waving your arms around outside like a mad person, picking up a telephone and calling to have a car service. People didn't just do ride sharing and build those apps because they wanted to. It's because people were tired of the waiting. They were tired of living life with giant delay between what they needed and what they wanted. And so, ride sharing, great example of how impatience is driving, I think, significant change. Delivery services. I mean, I wouldn't even know what to do without things like Amazon Prime. I don't know how to engage with people at the store, to do shopping, like to talk to people. It's hard. I want things now. I don't have to get in my car and go somewhere and do things, talk to people, engage generally, give presentations, none of that. So this is another example of why impatience, wanting things now, wanting things immediately is really driving significant change. And then of course online shopping, again, we want to know exactly what's in our cart. We want to know what's available. All of this is real. I mean, do you see it? Does anybody see it? Brian's nodding his head. Brian feels this way. I can't see anyone else. The other thing that's odd about this whole setup to me is the lights are incredibly bright. You guys don't see this, but I can barely see you for the lights. I just see Brian. Everyone else is a blur. Anyhow. But it extends to all sorts of interesting places. Everyone, not just me, not just Jeff, not just my children, everyone, everywhere is losing their patience. And this is some great examples, and you've heard a lot about them today. Social media, mobile apps, news, traffic, weather. Weather. I remember you'd wake up, you'd change the channel to the weather channel, hope to find your city flash across the screen to understand what the weather is going to be like. I'm old, I'm in my mid-70s, and it was not like that back then, or is now, right? I mean, now you open up an app, you get to see that right away. So there's all sorts of things. Everyone is losing their patience. And why is that? And what does it mean to all of us? Well, Kishore talked a little bit about this. There's a version of this graph. Because the longer you go, the longer you wait, from a system perspective, the longer or farther away you are from an event, right, the less value it is. The higher, you lose patience, right? The longer you wait, the less valuable it is. And when we think about systems, and Kishore talked a little bit about this today, there are different kinds of systems that address this problem in different ways. Real-time systems are designed for this world where you must have things immediately. Batch systems, on the other hand, don't work quite in that way, right? Batch systems exacerbate impatience. They get you the data sometime long after you really need it. And this is very true about again, this kind of value data. Does this make sense? You've seen all this before, right? I'm sure somebody out there is nodding their head. I can't see you because of the glare. But yes? Brian says yes. So when we think about it, I mean, impatience is changing so much. It's changing so many industries. And fundamentally, it's changing the way we capture and interact with data, right? Batch data, systems that take a long time to get from their original source to some place where it can be used, are no longer as valuable as they had been in the past. Things must be real time. And there's an interesting metric that was identified that speaks to this, I think. Yes, I am impatient. Yes, my children are. Yes, my boss is. Yes, all of these things are being transformed. But there's actually data that supports the extent to which real-time data, this need for immediacy, is changing fundamentally almost everything that we do. You guys can read this. I'll try to cut out the interesting or the high-level points here. Is that according to IDC, 147 zettabytes of new data were created in 2024. I didn't know a zettabyte, by the way, was a thing until I prepared for this. 174 zettabytes. And oh, by the way, I went to Google to figure out how many zeros that is. That's how many zeros. That's a lot of data. 174 zettabytes of data will be created in 2024. 24% of that data is expected to be real-time data. So think about that. Impatience, this lack of desire, this inability to wait for things, it's forcing all of these industries to change. It's forcing the creation of all sorts of new data, new sources of data. And what do I have to react to it? I have to have real-time systems to be able to address. That's what we're seeing. That's how many? 35 zettabytes of data this year alone will be created that is real-time data. That to me was an absolutely stunning figure. It's not just me. It's not just me being impatient. It's not everybody else. This is the real world. Everyone is suffering from this. And so what does that leave us? I mean, you've heard a lot about this today. I think you heard about this in the keynote. You've heard this in some other conversations, other presentations. You'll hear about this again. If this is reality, if people truly are impatient, if they truly are changing businesses, and they're generating that much data, the systems built to support these things have to adapt and change as well. They have to. I mean, this is an interesting kind of perspective. And again, I apologize if this is repetitive. It very well may be. But think about what this slide is attempting to show. Traditional systems that were more batch-oriented, that were used to be the supporting systems to deal with all those applications that we used before, they were very comfortable operating in minutes, hours sometimes. I need something, I'm going to wait minutes. I'm going to wait hours. That doesn't work anymore. Real-time analytics and real-time data need responses in milliseconds. That's how you have to operate on this data. And it's not just kind of how fast they have to return. The kinds of queries have changed. I mean, the data, the relationship between data, the different sources of data, the relationships between them are complex. To get true insights into that kind of data, to really make decisions in general, but certainly in real time, I can't just be executing a simple query to get that data, right, against some batch data that came in yesterday. This data has to be analyzed with very, very sophisticated queries, right? This is increasingly important in the work that we do. We want to tie sources of data together to get really valuable insights. And then the interesting thing here, and you've heard about this over and over and over again, and I think the folks at Apache Pinot will continue to talk about this over and over and over again. And certainly the use cases that you heard about this morning and some of the use cases we'll talk about in just a few minutes really speak to this. It has to be able to support not just a few users internally at a company, right? It has to be able to support hundreds of thousands of millions of users potentially simultaneously. So this move, being driven by impatience to real-time data away from batch, requires real change. And when you say it, you have to include kind of the hyphen. It's like you have, the way you enunciate that, pronounce real change, like real time. You get that now? That was a bad joke. I had a list in my mind of jokes I was going to go through. That hadn't been on there, and I wish I'd left it off. But I did, I kind of got carried away. You'll see this. I got carried away with the hyphen. I thought it was kind of fun. And so I used it in places it doesn't belong. I was hoping I wouldn't have to call it out and someone would appreciate it silently, but now I've blown that too. Anyway, so real time does require real change. We really do believe that. But real change has certain characteristics, right? And for us, of course, it means a system like Apache Pinot. But what does it mean? We kind of hinted at some of this. But in order to be successful in this economy, in order to operate on data that is not batched, that's coming at you in real time, in order to meet the users where they need to be, you have to have the freshest data, real-time ingestion. You have to have something called real-time upserts. Notice again the hyphen. I'm going to kill this hyphen thing over and over again. Real-time upserts, I'm not sure to the extent that we've talked about this a whole lot today, but that's a really, really important feature of real-time and streaming data. You can't always predict the kind of data that you're getting, the format is. Sometimes you need to be able to update rows or pieces of data that came in previously. Being able to do real-time upsert means you can really, really handle the freshest of data. Without that, you're doing batch stuff. You're doing all this other junk offline, and you're slowing things down. And obviously, stream processing, right? Being able to pull data directly off the stream. This is like a really important feature. To get real time, to have real change, you have to be operating on the freshest of data. And then, of course, you have to deliver the fastest possible performance. This is a characteristic of a system that's going to be successful in today's market, today's economy. There's some things in here that I won't necessarily mention, but there are a couple that stand out to me and I think are important, at least worth doubling down on. And that is indexing. You know, I've been in the data space for a long time, and indexing for many years was just like something that you had to do, and it wasn't too terribly exciting. I really feel like Pinot and StarTree are making indexing attractive again, exciting again, right? These systems, our system has literally dozens of different kind of indexes in order to work on data of all types. This is incredibly important when you're working with these kinds of systems. I have to have fresh data. I have to have the fastest performance. To do that, I have to have indexing that is as flexible and varied as the data that's coming into my system. And so if you haven't spent any time looking at Pinot and the indexing capabilities that it has, and oh, by the way, it's extensible, it's a pluggable interface. You heard today about the vector indexing. It's incredibly important. So real time, real change needs the fastest performance. Part of that story is, of course, indexing. And then concurrency. Again, we just talked about it, right? What good would any of this be if it were single user, 2, 3 users doing these things, right? We need to have systems that have and can support dozens, thousands of users. And then there's all sorts of other things here that are worth talking about. But in the interest of time, knowing that I stand between you and a pool party, we'll save these for a later discussion. Cool? Good. So the real purpose of this conversation was to talk about some of the use cases in which we're seeing this play out in the real world and why. And so maybe perhaps this was all too long of a wind-up, but nonetheless, we're here. So let's jump into just a handful of use cases. Some of these may be repetitive. You may have heard these today and earlier. And by the way, if you haven't had an opportunity not only to talk with the StarTree team, but just talk with each other, you may run into people who are behind some of the use cases that I'll be talking about today. So I will not attempt, I couldn't, attempt to explain them in the detail in which they could, and they should. So I just want to kind of use maybe the next few minutes just to, again, highlight some of the problems and why that are being solved by these systems. Certainly can try to answer questions. There are plenty of people in this room that can, if we need to go there. There's a booth outside to go into detail. But really, more importantly, as we talk about some of these use cases from places like Uber and Stripe, if you see somebody with that name tag, go ask them about the details, because they are fascinating, fascinating stories. So it is real story time. You get it? Like, instead of real-time stories, it's like real story time. I was as proud of this slide as maybe anything I've done lately. Anyway, I know. Jeff's like, why do I allow this to happen? And Jess, who asked me to do this, is like, this was a huge mistake. Everything about this is wrong. And so I apologize to everyone, really. But anyway, I kind of wanted to frame this a little bit differently, and we'll see how long. Hopefully, this won't take terribly long. But instead of kind of going through all the kind of the minutia of the use cases and what they have accomplished and all the technical details, which again, as I said, we can find people to answer all those. As I have been reviewing them and learning these use cases over the year that I've been here, there are things about these use cases that really stand out to me. And not only that, as I think about them through the lens of impatience, it's really, I thought, the kind of an interesting way to look. So the first use case I wanted to mention, and you may have heard about this and read about this in other places. By the way, there is a phenomenal blog on the website that goes into all sorts of detail about this. But the first use case I wanted to mention was WebEx. And this 150x I thought was a really interesting thing. Well, what is that? So when WebEx began to evaluate Apache Pinot, they were using some other technologies, and they wanted, of course, like everyone does when evaluating a new technology, wanted to see what or how Apache Pinot performed against other technologies that they had already invested in. And 150x is the performance improvement that Cisco WebEx saw on some of those workloads when evaluating Apache Pinot. That is a stunning number to me, having spent a lot of time in benchmarking. I mean, you hope to be a little better than your competitors, just a little bit. 150 times better, that's a lot. That's a lot. So a little bit about, again, I won't go into all the details about what WebEx does. There is an incredibly interesting blog about this. But if we think about impatience, right? What was happening at Cisco WebEx when they embarked on this journey? We all remember the pandemic, working from home, COVID-19 really changed how we all do work, right? And it forced many of us into our homes. I started in my house and never left and barely leave now, and that's a whole other thing that bothers me immensely. It's why I'm so happy to be out. This is like my big week out. But anyway, you know, Cisco saw unprecedented growth in their usage. But with that, of course, came lots of challenges, right? And nothing is more infuriating. Nothing tries your patience. And this happened a lot then, and to some extent, even now happens with various other systems, right? You're trying to dial into your meeting. You're ready for your presentation. Somebody asks you an important question, and your video freezes, or your audio goes, to you know what. Like, that's incredibly frustrating. That tries my patience. I mean, like nothing else does. And so WebEx identified that, look, hey, we have had this spectacular growth. We have to understand what's happening in our system. We have to get a better handle on the quality of our audio and video at a scale we've never had to operate before, right? And that's kind of essentially what led them down this path of needing to evaluate this technology. And they did, and guess what they found? Oh, my goodness. We can get 150x on certain queries better than what we had today. So again, impatience, it's not just like a moniker. It's not like a funny thing. Like, people's frustration with having to work from home, poor audio-video experience, Cisco WebEx wanting to capture that market and be the best possible solution in that space drove them to get a better handle on how to have a smooth customer experience, to reduce the friction, the frustration of that. And Pinot was part of that process. By the way, it's a huge number of events that they're seeing. I mean, it's up here, 1 billion events per day. Maybe for some of you in this room, that's a small number. It's a huge workload, and really, really fascinating. So I kind of like this one too. This is another one of the use cases that, again, you may have heard. Again, company sovereign. We have a wonderful blog video. They've been very generous with their time with us. Wonderful story. I don't know how many of you know what Sovereign is. It was not awesome. They're in the ad tech space, the publishing space, right? And kind of the way they sell themselves, position themselves, is the relationship they have with their publishers, their content creators. They're as invested in their success as any other company can be. And it was incredibly important to them to give visibility into how their producers' content was being received, right? And again, thinking about impatience, their content creators in the early days of their platform would have to wait up to 48 hours to get insights into content that they had just released. Imagine that. I'm a content creator. I'm a publisher. I put something out there. I want to know, is this working? Like, is this presentation working? Obviously, the answer to that is no, but others are like, is this happening? Is this going well? And I got to wait 2 days to find out? That would drive me that would drive me crazy. I would not have the patience for that, right? And so Sovereign decided they needed to make a change, and the change they made was implementing Pinot. And again, wonderful, wonderful stories in detail on the website. But again, similar kind of theme, right? What Pinot did for them at tremendous scale was solve this experience problem, put data into their customer's hand in a way they didn't have access to it before. If we go back, this idea, oops, I went the wrong way. Now I'm hitting the wrong buttons. Oh, my God. We had 48 hours to zero. In other words, 48 hours to sub-second latencies. That was the turnaround time. And again, I think that is a remarkable change and impact to someone's business. OK, I'm going to wrap this up, I think, pretty quick. I'm going to try to. I said that before, and then I ended up talking for 20 minutes, so I apologize. Another piece, not really impatience per se. This metric, money doesn't really tie to impatience as much as maybe time does. And you may have heard this. I think Kishore mentioned this a little bit, but there's a really interesting story from the folks at Uber. In fact, there are many interesting stories from the folks at Uber. Again, there have been some talks today. I think there are talks tomorrow. Again, another use case that's incredibly well documented. But there's some big savings happening at Uber by adopting this technology. Well, why? What were they doing? Again, this may be conflating a couple of different use cases, so my apologies, but I'm going to try to paint with somewhat of a larger brush here. Again, think about how this market has changed, right? Uber, I don't remember the time frame, but has taken off like a rocket, right? Everybody, I don't hail taxis anymore, right? I call to get a ride. Their app is incredibly pervasive. Everybody, I'm sure, in this room has Uber installed on their phone, right? Well, as software tends to do at times, it crashes, right? And that's a frustrating thing. That will try your patience if you're trying to get from the airport to home or the airport to a business meeting. You pull up Uber and the app crashes. I can't get to where I want to go. That'll ruin your day. One of the interesting little facts about Uber that I did not realize is that they have about 11,000, this is in the blog, 11,000 new code and infrastructure changes every week, right? So they're constantly changing, right? This isn't a static company. The app isn't static. The systems aren't static. They're constantly changing to improve. And they needed visibility into what was working, what's not, across a whole bunch of different systems. App crashes, all sorts of infrastructure. And they had been using a different technology to peer into that, to try to make the lives of their users better, internal and external. And they got introduced to Pinot and adopted it across a number of different places. And among all the other things that it did, the metric I chose to pull out, and of course there are others here that you can read, but when switching from a search technology, which is listed here, right, they actually saved a ton of money. Not only did they make the experience better, were they able to stay on top of issues and all sorts of other things, actually saved money doing it. That might be important for you in this room. Maybe you're not operating at the scale of some of these companies, but it might be damn well important to save a little bit of money on whatever it is that you're doing, right? And you can do that with technologies like Pinot and StarTree. I think two more. This is one last thing. 1 second. You know what 1 second is? Good. So Citi is a really, really interesting use case. It's not one we talk a whole lot about, but I thought I would share some details about their usage, which I think is fascinating. It's kind of technical. It may be not as easy to relate to as some of the other stories, but I'll give it a go. So Citi is using Apache Pinot in their market risk department, but that's not the right word. I can't think of what it is. But they're using Apache Pinot to calculate intraday risk, to monitor and manage their exposure in capital markets. What are capital markets, you might ask? I don't know. So don't ask me. Ask somebody else. But they're important. A ton of money flows through this. And the exposure to not understanding and managing that risk could be detrimental to Citi's customers. Now talk about patience and impatience and all of that business. Before the introduction of Pinot into this process, do you know how often the team at Citi was reviewing this risk in an effort to manage or mitigate their exposure? Once a day. I mean, think about how the world is changing. Think about how across something as complex as capital markets, all the varying dimensions that you need to analyze and understand, you're checking in on that once a day in order to update positions. That was incredibly inefficient. And there's a lot of subtlety here about the complexity of doing this across multiple dimensions that is not worth going into now. But needless to say, not something done easily by other technologies. And when they were able to adopt Pinot, instead of monitoring the risk of billions of dollars, in fact, what do my notes say? Billions of events per day over roughly 1 million positions. Instead of analyzing the risk on those positions once a day, they were doing it essentially every second. Huge impact. I mean, that fund manager, think about his afternoon, right? He's waiting for that next report the next day to see, whoops, did we do something wrong? Should we have been somewhere that we're not? Now he sees that every day. Transformational for their business. And then I'll end with kind of one that I think has been mentioned a few times, but again, the visualization here is pretty interesting. And certainly this is a very well-known brand. This particular metric I thought was interesting. And again, there are a number of Stripe folks here, so certainly plenty of people to have more detailed conversations. But in less than 1 second across trillion rows. I mean, think about what's happening at Stripe. Think about what happened at Stripe on Black Friday. The amount of money that passed through that system. You saw in Kishore's keynote today kind of a visualization of this dashboard being powered by Pinot. And again, there are many use cases at Stripe that are being supported by Pinot, so we could kind of cherry pick which of the ones we're talking about here. But needless to say, follows a very similar pattern. They were able to take latencies down that were in the order of minutes down to seconds. I mean, there's nothing more frustrating than when you're trying to check out or buy something and that transaction doesn't work, right? That will try and grate your patience. Swiping my card, it's not working. I go to submit an online payment, it's not happening. Waiting to figure out what's wrong. Stripe waiting to figure out what wasn't working on their internal systems on the order of minutes or hours is not a good thing. And when they were able to adopt Pinot, among many other things, they were able to solve that problem and that visibility. And what's the statistic that we saw? What was the number of transactions that passed through Stripe on Black Friday? What was it?
18.6 billion.
18.6 billion.
In that 4-day period.
Yeah. And all of that being analyzed, and the systems being analyzed by tools like Apache Pinot. So, in summary, thank you for listening to this and humoring me. But really just kind of going back to kind of the key points. We do think there's fundamentally something happening out there, right? The world, it's just said so many times, but there's truth to it. The world's changing, right? We're demanding a different kind of experience from the services that we use. We want things now. We don't want to wait. We don't want to lose patience. We don't want to be frustrated and angry. You know, when somebody texts you and you don't respond for a minute and you get upset, Jeff, like we don't want that in our world, right? To counteract that, to solve those problems, we need systems that can operate on the freshest of data, right? Data coming right off the stream, not batch data. Nobody has time for that. We need real-time data. We need to operate on the freshest of data. We need the fastest performance. We don't need systems that take minutes and hours to respond. We need systems that can respond immediately. And then, of course, who's going to use this stuff? What good is it if any of these things are just for a couple internal users, right? We need systems that can support millions of concurrent users. We need systems like Uber, right? We all pull up the phone when we leave here and get a cab. That would work very well if you had to stay, you know, only one of us could use it at a time, right? We have concurrency, high concurrency. These are the kind of systems we need to tackle this. And that's what Pinot does. There is no better system for low latency, for fresh data, for high concurrency. It's kind of what's helping solve or lower this frustration generated by what we like, I think, to call the impatience economy. So with that, we wrapped up actually 11 minutes and 40 seconds early. I'm kind of proud of myself. It's 6 o'clock. There's apparently a happy hour upstairs by the pool, is there not? At 6. Not right now. Yes, I'm sorry. I gave you additional time to go to your rooms and relax. With that, any questions? Any thoughts? Hello. I can't really see you, but I see that there's a hand. Yes, hello.
Oh, sure. Yeah, hi. My name is Caroline. I work for Stellar Data. I do have a question. I was noticing that on the use cases that you shared In many cases, the incumbent was Elasticsearch.
Yes.
And it didn't really, based on what I know about Elastic, it didn't seem like they were all that well suited for any kind of analytics type of use case.
Correct.
What, given the proliferation of multiple real-time analytics companies, multiple real-time analytics vendors, open source, what kind of makes Pinot, what gives you the special sauce to solve that kind of use case versus an incumbent that's maybe more appropriate for a type of real-time analytics use case?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I think you're right. And I had this conversation earlier today. So you're right, Elasticsearch was mentioned a few times, and we do see this actually quite a bit, but it's not unique to Elastic, so I don't want you to leave this room and think that we're picking on them. We're not. But you said something that was very astute, and it's true, which is oftentimes when people adopt technology, it starts and is used for one thing, and then it's kind of a little easier to just use that thing for something that it wasn't designed for as the next step, you know? Like, hey, it was great over here. We already have it. Maybe we could use it and apply it here. And it wasn't all by accident, by the way. I mean, you know, Elastic has gotten into the analytics space, and it positions itself in some ways to do some things that would look like an overlap with what we do. But I think in general, and we see this across lots of different technologies, some folks get into places with certain technology investments that they didn't need to be there, right? It didn't belong. It wasn't a good fit for that technology. And then what ends up happening is they pour a ton of money into that tech to expand it. This was, by the way, this was the story at LinkedIn, right? If you saw the keynote. What was the LinkedIn story? It went from 1,000 nodes. They had to scale up their existing tech stack to 1,000 nodes to meet the demand. They could have kept going, of course. They could have moved it to 2,000 and maybe wouldn't even be here talking today, right? But at some point, scaling up these technologies that really weren't built to solve this specific problem makes no sense. And so that's what we're seeing. It's not just Elastic. A lot of technologies that have started to try to play this high-scale, low-latency analytics game, they weren't really built to do it, struggle at the high end. And I think maybe that's how I would answer the second part of that question to some extent. It's kind of, well, great, this is all fine. There are a lot of people doing this. Why should I care about Pinot? Why should I care about StarTree? And I think the answer is actually at LinkedIn. And what I mean by that, and to some extent what we talked about here. You know, you can say a lot of things about this technology, right? But one thing is essentially indisputable, and that is it's already been proven at mass scale. You know, that is not something other technologies can say. They don't have that historical experience. And let me tell you, having worked on many and worked for many companies that struggle to get through that kind of growth curve where they haven't had users really test them, that's a brutal place to be, right? You don't want to be somebody's first big customer, I can assure you that. And that is not the case at Pinot and StarTree. You know, it's going to be really hard to show this technology something it hasn't seen before. And so I think that's kind of the difference. The argument I would make when looking out at kind of the vast universe of people who are saying, I can do this too. Maybe you can, but you haven't yet. Yes. What else? I feel like I got like negative and angry and kind of emotional there, and that was not my intent, by the way. How dare you? Well, listen, we got 7 minutes. I promised I would let you walk out early. Thank you for humoring me. Hopefully it wasn't too terribly painful.